Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another in the series of Tiffin Talks of the Australia-India Institute. This is, I think, our second one for this year, but after a long, long summer break, we're back into action, and we'll have... So those of you who aren't regular attendees, I hope you keep in touch with this series of very diverse, but always very interesting talks and discussions about some aspects of the relation, about India and in particular Australia's connection with India. Today, we're delighted that Professor Mattoo will speak to us. I think everyone here is well aware of who he is. Amitabh was the director of the Australia-India Institute here for nearly 4 years. He is still a professor at JNU and a professor at Melbourne University. And he is also the inaugural director of the Australia-India Institute at Delhi. This is our new project where we've established a presence in Delhi to complement the presence in Australia. It's a very exciting development for the university, obviously for the institute, and I think for the whole country, which will hopefully expand our capacity to engage with India on all sorts of levels. Professor Mattoo will today speak to us on an early assessment of the Modi government. It's now 10 years since the landslide which swept Mr. Modi into power. And there's been lots of changes. But as we Australians well know, winning power is one thing, doing something is another thing. So we'd be very interested to hear from Amitabh on those matters. The format today is that Professor Mattoo will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions or comments. This talk is being live streamed, so if you do want to ask a question or make a comment, please wait until someone brings you a microphone, which will let the audience in other places hear what you have to say. So, as I say, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Amitabh Mattoo.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege and pleasure to return to Melbourne and to speak at a Tiffin Talk. I think we are now entered the 4th or the 5th year of Tiffin Talks. And I remember when we first had a Tiffin Talk, it was in the chemistry building, in a room there, and there were about 5 people there. So this audience today is just reflective of not just the success of the Australia-India Institute, but also the manner in which there's been a growing interest in all things Indian, and of course also in the Australian-Indian relationship. What I thought was it's risky making an early assessment for a variety of reasons. So this is really intended to provoke rather than judge. And one of the reasons why it is risky to make an early assessment about a government which has been in power for just 1 year is because you can often miss, in the case of India, the tree for the woods. Some might argue that you have had a 5,000-year-old civilization. You've had a continuity of ideas and identities, which of course changed over time, but still there was that spirit and idea of India which has been there for at least 2,000 years. You've had a nation state, an independent nation state for over 67 years, so it's easy to get this wrong. In fact, one of the great puzzles which everyone was fascinated by and most people got wrong was the puzzle of Indian democracy. Because till the 80s, almost every reasonable, respectable political theorist was convinced that democracy couldn't possibly survive in India, because when India became independent, liberal democracies had survived only in countries which had a relative degree of homogeneity, where there was a certain basic standard of living, and there weren't the kind of disparate economic, social, and geographical conditions. And yet, India, against all odds, not just survived as a democracy, but succeeded as a democracy. Except for a 19-month period, there's never been a moment through all these years where anyone has questioned the idea of Indian democracy. However, given the fact that Mr. Narendra Modi became Prime Minister with such huge expectations, nationally within India, but globally as well, also concerns, I think it's fair to try and see what has happened, what has changed over the last 10 months. This doesn't suggest that what has happened in the last 10 months will replicate themselves over the next 4 years, or that what has been put in place in these 10 months may not change. But I think it's you can get a fair idea of where we are going by looking back at these past 10 months. Now remember also that Mr. Modi swept into power, as the chairman just pointed out, as the first time that the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, first time that they won a majority on their own, the first time any party in over nearly 3 decades had won a majority on its own. So you had nearly 3 decades of coalition rule, sometimes effective, often weak, and the last 5 years of the Congress-led coalition rule was seen as particularly dysfunctional. So there was that hope and expectation that you now have a strong government which hopefully can deliver on the promise of India. What I did, and because we're going to reduce this talk to just 15 minutes in order to engage, interact, and provoke more discussion, what I thought is make an early assessment in terms of 4 areas: foreign policy, economics, governance, and social issues. And in some ways, there is a hierarchy, because I mark all these 4 sectors, and the foreign policy sector is undoubtedly the sector in which Modi performed beyond expectations, but perhaps outperformed most Indian leaders since perhaps Rajiv Gandhi. Now, remember that when Modi came into power, most people had assumed that he would be much more inward-looking, that he would be much more domestic-focused, and do all the kinds of things that he had done in Gujarat in terms of boosting investor confidence, in terms of getting the regulations right, in terms of creating an environment in which good governance is possible. So many had assumed that Modi would focus on a much more on the domestic agenda. Quite in contrast, Modi's not primary, but certainly one of the areas of renewed thrust has been foreign policy. No Indian Prime Minister in recent times has traveled as much as Mr. Modi has done over the last 10 months. And he's traveled across the world. And as you will recall, when he visited here in November, each one of these visits has not been just a formal, official signing-off ceremony. It's been a robust engagement with business, with civil society, with academia, with political leaders, whether it's in Japan, whether it was the United States, whether it is in Brazil, whether it's in Europe, or whether it's in Australia. Similarly, what we have seen in foreign policy, quite apart from the engagement with the great powers internationally, has been a much more robust engagement with India's neighbors. India has perennially had a difficult neighborhood. In fact, the question often used to be asked was, how can India escape its neighborhood? And everyone recognized that you really cannot escape your neighborhood because you can change your friends, but you can't change your neighbors. So quite apart from Pakistan and Afghanistan, which I'll come to in a minute, you see a much more robust engagement with Nepal, with Bangladesh, with Bhutan, with Sri Lanka, where if you were to believe the grapevine in the press, India successfully got rid of the most authoritarian, totalitarian dictator, Mr. Rajapakse, through free and fair elections. But certainly India was convinced, as were many others, that Mr. Rajapakse's continuation was not just bad for Sri Lanka, bad for India-Sri Lanka relations as well, and bad for building a much more inclusive Sri Lanka. Mr. Modi invited all the South Asian leaders to his inaugural ceremony. And even with Pakistan, although there's been criticism that there's been that the relations ever since Mr. Modi took over have been on a roller coasters and there have been highs and lows, but you begin to see a pattern of sustained engagement despite the right-wing fringe of the Sangh Parivar not always endorsing Mr. Modi's foreign policy towards Pakistan. So you see much greater creativity, much greater imagination, much greater energy in India's foreign policy. I'm not saying it's been an unqualified success, but for the first time, a large number of countries, including in India's east, who have had traditionally great concern about China, but little hope that India would forget balanced China, even emerge as a potential counterweight, along with many others, have begun to see new hope in India. More critically, I think in the last 1 year, you have seen perhaps the most decisive shift in Indian foreign policy since 1971. In 1971, India moved away from its non-alignment policy in response to the Nixon-Kissinger tilt towards Pakistan and the opening towards China. In the last 10 months, you've seen a much more explicit tilt towards the United States. Reflected, I'm not arguing that this is the best thing that could have happened to foreign policy, Indian foreign policy, but this is the reality of Indian foreign policy. And this is symbolically reflected that for the first time ever in the history of independent India, you have had, in a period of less than 10 months, 2 summit-level meetings in Washington and Delhi between President Obama, President of the United States, and a Prime Minister of India. And in terms of taking charge of the foreign policy establishment, Mr. Modi has been ruthless. And I say this with due respect to the Foreign Minister of India, and that she is an important functionary, but it is the Prime Minister's office which runs India's foreign policy. And now increasingly, after the departure of a great friend of Australia, a great High Commissioner to Australia, Sujata Singh, and the appointment of a great confidant of Mr. Modi, Mr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, you have the Prime Minister's office and the Foreign Secretary's office calling the shots in India's foreign policy. And that is good for India, because for a long time, or at least 3 or 4 years, India's foreign policy seemed to have lacked the momentum, the direction that it was needed. And this was conceded. And full tributes to him for conceding this. Manmohan Singh's National Security Advisor, a very bright diplomat who was an earlier Foreign Secretary, Shiv Shankar Menon, in an interview conceded that the foreign policy of the National Democratic Alliance, led by Mr. Modi, was certainly much more engaged, much more robust than had been the case of Mr. Modi's predecessor, Dr. Manmohan Singh. So 9 out of 10 on foreign policy, 8 out of 10 on economics, and only because I think the expectations were, and they were unreal, that there would be a radical perestroika, for want of a better word, a huge set of big bang reforms that would transform India suddenly and bring in investment of an unimagined, unprecedented scale. What you've seen, however, is what the finance minister referred to is a much more creative incrementalism. And that's reflected in the full first budget of the Modi government in late last month. And if you see all the various analysis of the report, of the budget, from all the consultancy companies, there's not even one which is negative. Whether it's the four big accounting companies, Deloitte, KPMG, PwC, Ernst & Young, positive. Some of the commentaries, again, positive, realizing that what the budget is trying to do, along with the other measures that have been taken, is address the fundamental weaknesses of the Indian economy in terms of infrastructure, in terms of skills, in terms of the three critical areas, which is land, the necessity of land reforms, and you've seen the land acquisition bill being passed by cabinet despite the objections of the Congress party, power and infrastructure, and skilling India. You've begun to see in all these areas, and the budget itself was identified them quite consciously, a new phase of liberalization, but a phase of liberalization which is not geared at creating a big bang, but creating, as I said, the necessary structural changes which will serve India in the Indian economy in the long term, matched by fiscal prudence, as well as now a target of this year of a GDP of about 8%, and that's not an unrealistic target, because the last quarter's GDP of 2014 was already above 6% or 6.5%. And even last year, and you might say that that's because there's been a slump of energy prices, but clearly and categorically you see that India's own policies, Modi's policies, the fiscal prudence of the RBI has brought down inflation, and there's no reason why, if the policies continue, you won't witness 7 to 8% growth, which will be a greater growth than that witnessed by any of the BRICS countries in the last 2 years. We can go into the details of what else needs to be done, but clearly I think in the economy, 8 out of 10, because there's much, much more to do, but in the right direction. In some ways, there's a conundrum about centralized or governance, or even an oxymoron, because what Modi has done is also decentralized fiscally in a way that the states will get a larger share of the taxes, of the revenues. But in terms of the governance model, it's completely centralized. Outside the Prime Minister's office, and ever-expanding Prime Minister's office, there are only a few ministries which have a carte blanche. In Australia, it is the norm that the Premier or the Prime Minister at the federal level and the Premier at the state level decides not only who can be a permanent secretary or a secretary of a department, but also the chief of staff. In India, it was unknown. Every minister relied on that power of patronage to appoint his personal staff, to appoint others who had been useful to him or her. That's completely changed. No one can appoint even a private secretary without permission, approval, and in some cases with recommendation of the Prime Minister's office. This is just symbolic. it might be trivial, but it's symbolic of the degree of control that the Prime Minister's office exercises today. Of course, this has generated a variety of uncorroborated anecdotes about how one minister was traveling, was going on an official tour abroad, and he was wearing Levi's jeans on the way to the airport, and he got a call from the Prime Minister's office which said, "You can't travel. You're a minister. You're a minister. Even in an aeroplane, you have to be dressed appropriately." Of course, whether it's true or not is different, but it's created a climate in which the kind of license that ministers had it's no longer possible to exercise that patronage, to exercise that individual freedom to an extent where the Prime Minister's office during the Manmohan Singh government had really been reduced to a cipher. However, as we know, there are prices to be paid for the centralization, and there are those who feel that there is a kind of Orwellian design behind this centralization, and that you need to be constantly aware and guard against that and fight back when necessary. Similarly, I think in terms of governance, clearly while Mr. Modi has led by example, one of the greatest public relations disasters was the fact that he wore a 1 million rupee suit, $20,000 Seville row, custom-made, with his name woven into the pinstripes. I think that was a huge public relations disaster. For me, my anecdotal way of capturing public opinion is my wife's aunts, who live in Jaipur and other parts of India, who are die-hard BJP supporters, wouldn't vote for any other party, but were totally disillusioned when Mr. Modi, when the news broke about him wearing this suit, because it was in complete contrast to the image of him being, of his humble origins and the way in which he was questioning and challenged and succeeded in defying dynastic power despite his humble roots. I think cleverly, Mr. Modi then auctioned his suit, which fetched nearly $500,000. But the damage was done, and that damage was done particularly in Delhi, where contrary to even the best expectations of the common man's party, the Aam Aadmi's party, they swept in power, and they, except for, I think, 3 seats, the BJP was completely trounced in Delhi. So the governance model, as I say, 7, people might say that that's probably too much, but I began with 6, and then I told COG to change it to 7, just because I want to be optimistic at the end of the day. And the final is, of course, inclusive India, the idea of India. And that's, I think, let me begin with the positive part. I come from Kashmir, and I think the greatest thing that's happened there in Jammu and Kashmir is the alliance between the PDP and the BJP. The alliance between the PDP and the BJP is an alliance that I support, because it brings together the aspirations of the Kashmir Valley together with the aspirations of people in Jammu. But it also puts in place a formula for moderation, a formula to temper extreme tendencies, and that's happening. Article 370, or removal of Article 370, was an article of faith with the BJP. But once they've arrived at a common minimum program, and 370 actually gives a special status to Jammu and Kashmir, and BJP has long opposed that special status, but when they formed a government with the PDP in power, they kept that and acquiesced that until such time that the alliance falls out, or that the special status of Jammu and Kashmir will be retained. So I think for Mr. Modi's national, international image of essentially a statesman to be, a cosmopolitan statesman to be, this is the best thing that could have happened. But what you have is tendencies within the BJP and within the Parivar who are probably trying to undermine Mr. Modi's prime ministership. In any case, and these are fringe elements, are tendencies which are really disturbing, and disturbing the Christian minorities and the Muslim minorities. Now, it's a question of perception. But when a former police commissioner of Mumbai, Julius Ribeiro, who fought the Pakistani militancy and who's an Indian patriot to the core of his body and soul, says that he's upset that churches are being attacked, there's something which needs to be done. For a long time, I think Mr. Modi did not come out vocally condemning these tendencies, but he has done it now because he realized that this was damaging him. For a while, it was assumed that this is beneath the Prime Minister's. It was not a response that did not require a response from the Prime Minister. But he became aware after the Delhi elections, but also because of all the international bad press, and also because citizens, good citizens of India, came out ferociously against these attacks, that something needed to be done. He's distanced himself, he had condemned these tendencies, but we'll have to wait and see. Because whether you like it or not, and you might attribute it to all sorts of other causal factors, the challenge before the Prime Minister, the BJP and the government has to be to ensure that while you provide good governance, while you help the economy scale new heights, while you give India a great boost in terms of its foreign policy, that you're seen as being inclusive, and that you ultimately remember, respect, and celebrate the idea of India, and that is the idea of celebrating diversity. India and Indians have never seen diversity, as have many others, as a weakness, but as a strength which adds to the potency of our cultural climate, our economic climate, and indeed earns us global acclaim. Thank you very much. Yeah, Q&A. And could you please introduce yourselves?
Yes, I'm Hans Baer, an anthropologist in the School of Social and Political Sciences. Thanks for that assessment. I'd just like to get your rating on two dimensions. One, environmental sustainability, because it sounds India is very much committed to the growth paradigm, as are virtually all governments around the world. But the other one is also a social justice one, or social equality, because I understand that India, like most countries, is a country of growing gaps between the rich and the poor. And maybe the poor have been pulled up, but now you have numerous billionaires, multi-billionaires in India. So how would you rate Prime Minister Modi on those two dimensions, environmental sustainability and social justice or social equity?
I think, let me take the last one first. And you're absolutely right that issues of social and economic equity, particularly economic equity, remain huge challenges. I mean, a few years ago, a friend of mine, Arjun Sen Gupta, did a survey and found that half of India or more lives in less than $1 a day. And that continues to be probably the case with with some incremental differences. Now, you've had traditionally, as you would know, two ways to address social inequity and poverty. Direct subsidies, or the more neoliberal model of hoping that economic growth will trickle down. India, traditionally, you've done both, sometimes emphasizing the former, more direct subsidies, but also recognizing that often what happens is that subsidies don't reach the people. In fact, Rajiv Gandhi once in the 1980s said that only 10% of what is earmarked as subsidies for the poorest to the poor actually reaches them. And so 90% is taken away, or is a transactional cost because of various middlemen involved in that process. What the Congress government started and what has been followed up by the Modi government is direct transfers, as well as creating a bank account based on this unique identity, which again was a project of the previous government led by the great technologist Nandan Nilekani, which was not abandoned, contrary to what people thought. that the unique ID program would be abandoned. That wasn't abandoned by the Modi government, and they've started a Jan Dhan Yojana, a way in which every Indian will get a bank account and will be able, and subsidies could be directly transferred, or there could be direct transfers of cash. Again, there's a Make in India, Skill India program, which, if they succeed to the manner in which Mr. Modi has suggested they would probably address this issue of economic equity. It's not, there's no easy answer, there's no magic mantra, but clearly the accusation before the election was that Modi was going to be a prisoner of capitalists, that this was just going to be crony capitalism. I think he's dispelled that impression, because there is no abandonment of what were traditionally described as populist schemes, which had been introduced by the Congress government. Economics, environmental sustainability, again, I mean, quite apart from the sustainability part, Delhi is today one of the most polluted cities, and there's a large campaign being carried out on the pages of one major Indian newspaper on, which suggests that every Delhiite who is above the age of 35 has the lungs of a smoker. So it's this is in the capital of India. Again, these are, in terms of climate change issues, India has a position, but I think all these are policies which will need to be addressed, looked at again, reviewed, not in the light of the larger global picture, but also internally what's happening. Clearly, in terms of energy needs, India is greatly deficit and cannot just rely on alternative energy sources, although India is now looking at uranium and wind, but we'll have to continue to rely on coal, but simultaneously making an effort to try and see what are the kind of clean technologies, even with coal, which can at least not pollute the environment to the degree that they've done so in the past. Yeah.
My question is on your foreign policy.
Could you please identify yourself?
My name is Sundar Sharma. I originally come from Assam, but now I live in Australia.
So it's Sarma, not Sharma.
Yes, Sharma, yeah. Now, my question is on your foreign policy about, you did not mention anything about how Modi has dealt with China so far. Because China, I think, is a bigger danger to India than Pakistan is, because China claims almost a big chunk of northeast India as its own territory. And in 1962, China came almost close to the northern border of Brahmaputra River. So how is he helping India's relation with China or tackling it, the problem?
Yeah. I mean, to put it into context, the China-India border is the most peaceful that India has. I mean, I just say this as a caveat because I'm seen as being a China skeptic. While the line of control is alive, in a manner of speaking, every moment, there's not been a single person who's died on the India-China border for the last 30 years. But you're right, and I did hint at the fact that you've had the most decisive shift in India's foreign policy, a new, robust, I won't call it an alliance, but a new, robust relationship which has a strong military dimension, which talks about the South China Seas and the freedom of the seas explicitly in reference to China's own designs. That's the relationship with the United States. I think the question is that everyone, anywhere, is concerned about China. Everyone wants China's rise to be peaceful, hopes that it will be peaceful, but increasingly thinks that the Chinese leadership or the new leadership have abandoned the earlier Deng Xiaoping strategy of lying low. They think the time in the sun after 150 years of Western humiliation has come, but no one is clear how to respond, except you create your capacities and hope for the best. But what China, I fear, has done is alienated, except for North Korea and Pakistan, there's not a single neighbor of China that is not nervous about China. This is counterproductive. If you're going to be a great power, you're going to be a superpower, you don't begin by alienating all your neighbors, including even a state which is almost in the best sense of the almost a satellite of China. Even Cambodia, you begin to see churnings and a great deal of concern. But all across Southeast Asia, forget Abe. Look at Singapore, you look at Vietnam. In this center, there was the head of the Vietnamese foreign policy department who said, we are waiting for India to rise. Too much pressure on India at that stage. But clearly, I think the China conundrum is a conundrum that not just India is facing, but it's the world that's facing, because it's the same challenge. You hope that China's rise is going to be benign and peaceful. And also history teaches you that no matter how great you might be, how great the level of economic interdependence, and Alan Fels can probably talk to that much more, but that economic interdependence can often be a grand illusion. After anyone who studies the world wars in Europe will concede to that point immediately. This lady in the third row.
Thank you. I'm Councillor Jackie Fristacchi from the City of Yarra, and I'm pleased to say our Chief Executive Officer is Indian and would be here today, except she's flying out. But my question follows up from the earlier question about social equity, and it's a problem that's besetting a lot of democracies, as the contemporary French economist Thomas Piketty is identifying, with greater gaps between those of wealth and the more disadvantaged. You mentioned a couple of ways that are being dealt with in India, but could you comment on the other mechanisms in terms of taxation and redistribution through those mechanisms? And secondly,
could you repeat that last part?
In terms of achieving greater social equity and trying to reverse the growing gap between those of wealth and those more disadvantaged, could you identify how the other ways that Modi is looking at dealing with that through education and redistribution of wealth through tax policies to be able to pay for the sort of services that are needed, and the education and other services?
I mean, Piketty is, of course, a neo-Marxist critique of capital, but so I haven't read the book, so I can't critique him, but he's clearly a bestseller. I think Robert Johansson told me that you need to only read the New York Review of Books review of the book, but he's clearly emerged as one of the finest critiques of capitalism, Western capitalism, but I think, you know, India's, even in 1947, you always had a mixed economy, and you always try to moderate extreme tendencies. It's just a question of, as I said, the choices have been on direct redistribution and subsidies provided directly, and that did not work. As I said, the leakages in the system were such that most people who were at the bottom of the pyramid didn't really get those benefits. One is now, obviously, as I said, by creating this unique identity linked to a bank account, you might be able to have that done.
Education.
Of course, and I'll come to that. Now, education and skills are two important pillars of the Modi government, but have been so even of the past government. And there is a Right to Education Act. And my wife is here, and she's hoping to write a PhD on that and how that will transform India's schools and India's education system. But there is now a fundamental right to education between the ages of 8 and 14. Is that right? You wanted to add something? Yeah, 8 to 14. And similarly, skilling India is one of, it's not just a question of skilling a section of India. The challenge before India, and I keep saying this, is 600 million people under the age of 25 and a largely unskilled workforce. In contrast to Korea, which has 96% of its workforce skilled in an organized way, India till about 5 years ago, and that number may have improved since I last studied it, is about 4 to 5%. So you need to skill India across various social and economic criterion if you have to utilize this huge demographic dividend. So skilling India is one of the most important pillars of this government, and was of the Manmohan Singh government, except, as I said, that government lost its way. Taxation, redistribution, I think that's, it's not something that I have studied, but clearly I don't think that India is taxing to the extent of what it does, what Australians do. The highest tax bracket is 30%. But what I think the challenge has always been in ensuring compliance, because a majority of those who fall within the tax bracket, about 40%, not a majority, do not pay taxes. So there is an effort to get greater compliance. Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which again has been critiqued by a lot of people, but it is an idea which was floated and implemented by the previous government and which has been continued, which is really that every person, every able-bodied individual in a rural setting will be assured 100 days of work. So it's almost, but what has been critiqued is really almost creating that Keynesian caricature of digging a well and then filling it up. Yeah.
Yes, my name is John Rebel. I'm associated with the historical and philosophical studies. I'm just wondering why it is that rather than being neutral, India is becoming a very close partner of the American empire. And I think it's a very dangerous development given the nuclear weapons we have today. And we are, again, in a situation which is very similar to before the First World War, except that the superpowers have nuclear weapons. Now, I think India served a very good model when it was a country advocating neutrality, and I'm not sure why the current government wants to be part of the Washington consensus.
I think what you said is really profound, because I think you need to really understand what's happening. Of course, India never practiced neutrality and explicitly made it clear that what non-alignment was not neutrality, but it was a way of judging issues on their own merit. I mean, you won't be a Switzerland or a Austria and keep a distance, but you will you'll not be ideologically blind. So you won't be part of an alliance and accept whatever the alliance does or the leader of the alliance does, but judge every issue. If in Suez, you'll take a pro-Arab stand, on Korea, you may take a different stand. So that was the Nehruvian view of non-alignment, which was compromised because of the treaty with the Soviet Union. But clearly, a parsimonious response to your most profound question is that India's proximity to the United States is a function of its strategic distance from Beijing. The more China acts aggressively, the greater the likelihood that India will cozy up to the United States. One of the first visits of a leader from an international leader to Modi's India and to Gujarat was of Xi Jinping. And when that visit was happening, even while Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi Jinping were basking on a swing near the Sabarmati River, on the banks of which is the great ashram in which Gandhi lived, there was a border incursion by the PLA in Chuma in the Ladakh area. Unexplicable. Why do you time this during a Chinese presidential visit? Someone said, oh, it's the PLA which is not accepting the vice chairman of the military commission's orders. Absurd. And PLA is not a rogue, it's not the ISI. It's a disciplined, organized body which completely accepts the authority of the Politburo and the Secretary General of the Communist Party and certainly the military commission. But that's what's inexplicable about Chinese behavior in the last 10 months. Why do this? If you don't want India to cozy up to Washington, why time it so badly that you have a border incursion for several days and Chinese PLA-10s and patrolling, aggressive patrolling, just when your president is in India. And this is a repeat of a similar incident that had happened a year before, when India almost threatened to cancel the new Chinese Prime Minister's visit. Oshik.
Thank you, Professor Mattoo, for your pithy presentation. My question is, I wanted to ask you what you think about the fact that, or let me just rephrase it in this way. Do you think Modi's presentation of himself in the media or through the party apparatus as a post-ideological leader who's only committed to something called development, what is it that in this message that leads to people kind of buying it, across the board in many ways? And I ask this question because quite clearly his roots in the RSS and his commitment to the making of India as a Hindu nation has not disappeared from the way in which, if one analyzes what's happened in the past 1 year. And I want to kind of point at 5 such developments for the benefit of the audience here, some of whom might know about these, but particularly the beef ban legislations in Maharashtra and Haryana, both BJP-ruled states. The very recent enactment of a draconian anti-terror law in Gujarat, which was passed only last week. You mentioned the Land Acquisition Act, and that was clearly, the passage of it was a very, very raw deal for India's poor farmers. And the other being the appointment of the new censor board chief of films, who's clearly come out with official messages about how he'd look into ensuring that Indian cinema is sanitized of things that clearly the Sangh Parivar does not like.
Let me begin by saying that and I should make it categorically clear, and I'm sure there are friends of BJP here also, that I was never either a Modi Bhakt or a Modi cynic. So, I mean, I didn't see him in Manichaean terms. I see him for what he is. And a friend of mine called Swapan Das Gupta said Modi, after 2002, after Godhra, consciously decided to reinvent himself. And that the story of Gujarat post-2002, and of course there are many narratives, and I'm sure your narrative is as much based on evidence as others, that there is a certain development paradigm which was evidenced in Gujarat, which was non-ideological, which was clinical, which didn't seem to have an explicit Hindutva element in those years, with the result that everyone from Tatas to Ford Motors seemed to believe that there was something transformational happening in Gujarat. Now, you might say that that is crony capitalism, and you probably have some evidence, but I'm telling you from what that narrative is about. The reinvention of Modi is the reinvention of Gujarat as a model of development, which could then be extended across India. And the fact that you didn't have post-2002, again, there will be alternative explanation, that there hasn't been a major riot in Gujarat till Modi was chief minister. Some may say that is because the minorities were so suppressed, there was no question of riot. But that's also evidence of this new Modi who transformed Gujarat, wants to transform India on similar lines. All the points that you made, beef ban, and we were arguing about this the other day, and censor board, I think, all these things, censor board, I think is, I don't know who's appointed those members to the censor board, but frankly, the most powerful political film on Kashmir, Haider, you agree, you disagree, came out during the, I don't know whether it was this censor board, but certainly in the tenure of this government. Beef slaughter, and we were arguing about this, that this, this is more rooted. Of course, you might say that the BJP governments have had a more explicit agenda when they did this, but it's part of the directive principles of the Constitution, prohibition and cow slaughter. It's more related to that Gandhian legacy, which might now be misinterpreted, packaged as a Hindutva agenda, but it's part of the Constitution of India, not your fundamental rights, but your directive policy. And the other, and the friends of the BJP here might like to reflect, everyone says that in Gujarat, the RSS, the VHP had no control over the government. Once Praveen Tagwadia was Modi's best friend. But when Modi became chief minister, the firebrand VHP leader was almost a persona non grata. That there was a certain moderation that happened. Now, but why don't we have, you the friends of BJP here? None of you are here? I thought there were some friends of the BJP. Yeah, why don't you also respond? Because this was supposed to be interactive.
Thank you very much. I had a question, but I'll definitely try to answer some of the question. You very rightly said regarding the beef ban, it is constitutional. It is not something which is recently packaged. But again, if you look at beef ban, there have been several critics. And like you look at the United States of America, there's a ban in killing dogs. You can't kill a dog, you'll be imprisoned, right? So why? Because there's a sentiments attached to it. It's not that it's a very scarce species. We love that animal. Hence, there is a lot of, I would say more than 70% of Indians have sentiments attached to cow and against cow slaughtering. And hence, I would say Hindus. So if you look at Maharashtra government, this was there, the bill was there for last 15 years. Even the Congress was in power for 15 years, but they didn't abolish the bill, neither they passed the bill. So they were afraid of the vote bank area. But if you look at the fringe elements, or if you say the other, the VHP and the Sangh, absolutely, there are few circles which overlap. But when it comes to Modi, there was harsh criticism on Modi itself from Sangh Parivar and VHP. So I would say this is where the difference would be, and we cannot say that it is completely controlled by RSS. I hope I've answered or shed few lights. But I have one more question with regards to the trade, and especially Prime Minister Modi coming to Australia. If you look at the policies of 100 cities and the requirement of steels and resources and the minerals which Australia has, and with the demand depleting from China and China rejecting the dirty coal, do you think there is a big opportunity between India and Australia for this to boom? And if yes, then what are the obstacles?
I think, as I say this again and again, but there's a complete conversion of interests and values between Australia and India. And fortunately, Tony Abbott and Narendra Modi, perhaps also because of their social conservatism, seem to get along very well. In fact, a senior official of the government of India told me that Mr. Modi was deeply concerned when it seemed that Mr. Abbott's political fortunes were dwindling. In fact, he told him in Hindi, "Mera dost Tony kuch musibat mein lag raha hai," that my friend Tony seems to be in trouble. So there is that great chemistry built on now what seem to be strong foundations. And they've committed to signing an FTA. It might not be the most robust FTA, but certainly they'll begin by identifying sectors where you can do much more. And if that is signed this year and then move on and try and see how that FTA can be improved upon, that would be huge. I think that would signal not just the huge opportunities that exist, but really create the mechanisms by which those opportunities can be harnessed. You can already see that the FTA with China, how it's yielding huge dividends. And I think it's, you can see that happening with India as well. One last, Alan?
We're all very conscious of the female issue, particularly after the banning of the BBC programme. Is there any progress or what's happening there?
I think everyone. I mean, as I said, someone says India is the world's greatest opportunity, but India is also the world's greatest challenge. You can, in fact, there's someone who wants to now work in India and says there's no other country where you can make a significant difference to the way the world is going to be in 20 years There's a huge amount of consciousness. There's legislation in place to prevent any form of gender discrimination, violence. But the social reality is that there are sections and there are parts where women feel deeply insecure. Now, this film was more controversial, and I've seen it. It was an interview, a detailed interview with one of the alleged or one of the people who had committed that crime, and what seemed frightening and repelling was the clinical manner in which he seemed to tell the story. I believe in absolute freedom, subject to only few caveats. But as I said, I think this is not as simple as is made out to be. I think what would be the consequences of this person who had apparently been paid money as well, and what would be its impact be, I don't know. I would personally want this film screened, but there's a debate, and I don't know how many of you have seen India's Daughter? Yeah. Anita? Four Corners is showing it on Monday, and that is the chilling. It's the paralleled with really the most telling account of the victim's mother, Nirbhaya's, the Braveheart's mother, paralleled with this chilling account of this rapist. Thank you so much, and Robert?
So, I'm sure on everyone's behalf, thank you very much, Amitabh. As usual with Amitabh, we have the broad sweep, sort of wide views on all the sorts of possibilities and implications, but also all that illuminated by sort of very rich detail and personal involvement. I think it's still the case that the relationship between Australia and India is one of immense possibility. Perhaps now Australia is more recognised even within India than it was in the past. But it's, I think, incumbent on all of us to work hard to build this relationship, both for our own sakes, but also for the whole sake of the region and the world. Thank you very much, Amitabh. We look forward to seeing you all at future Tiffin Talks. Thank you for coming.